It was a time of sadness, oh my heart, though I knew to love the better part. And well I thought was given to me my test of faith and love to be. It seems that if I ne'er can be sure that faith to the end I shall endure, thus long nor trust to all his might, to walk by faith and not by sight. I thought the cross that I could bear, for its weight was heavy there. If I could lay my burdens down, I should not fear to lose my crown. Evening shadows seemed quite to tell, and weary though my spirit felt, for then there came a heavenly light, as to calm my raptured sight. Angelic music filled the air, as flighted deities tussled there. Then one who bade them bow the knee, the Lord came and stood and smiled at me. Come gently to me as I tremble lay, and follow me, he said, for I'm the way. Before me crosses of every shape appeared, more magnificent than mine I feared. But then I saw once a beauty to behold, with jewels encircling it in gold. Thought I, this will be one to wear, this one would be fine to bear. And so this little cross did I take, but the cross did tremble and shake. The sparkling jewels, fair they to see, for all too heavy was their weight for me. They may not be, I cried and looked again, for comfort then to ease my pain. But one by one I passed them by, till a lovely one that caught my eye.
Clarence Freese had a lot of free time. Carpenters could not work when there was no building work to be done. And a great deal of the time in the winter, he did not work at all. He didn't worry about it too much, however, and the cellar was always well stocked with supplies of all kinds. He loved to fish through the ice on Turk Lake in the winters with a spear. He built himself a little portable house and put a little stove in it, and sometimes he sat on the ice all day long with a spear in hand. If a big pickerel came along, that's a fun kind of fish, he'd try and spear it. Sometimes he got them as large as 25 pounds, and they made wonderful meals. Lucinda had a way of stuffing them just like turkey, and the family declared that they'd like them as much too. Clarence also did a lot of hunting up in his 90 acres, and boasted that one winter he shot 150 rabbits on his place. The family enjoyed big rabbit dinners as their pleasure. This was accomplished by hanging the rabbits in a row along a wire out in the yard. So at least they eat them. Yeah, it's gross, but at least they eat them, so it's fine. Whenever they wanted rabbit for dinner, he just went out and took a couple off the line. They were then thawed out and cleaned down in the cellar by the furnace. Summers also had slack times, and it was then that Clarence had to work for himself. Summers also had slack times, and it was then that Clarence had to work for himself. This was accomplished in various ways, and one of them being he offered his services at the fair or the carnival grounds. When a carnival was coming to town, Clarence Freese was right on hand to give advice as to how stands should be built, and other advice. He even offered to build them and furnish the lumber. Sometimes he would get paid for all his work, but more often than not, the carnival would go broke, and then Father couldn't collect his money. Much of a carnival. It was a particularly hot day one summer when Father worked all day building stands for the carnival. Sure enough, at the end of the carnival's stay, they had no money to pay him. So at least they said that. Well, for several years now, you've owed me money. They're obviously screwing him over, is what they're doing. They build our stands for us and we'll leave. It was a particularly hot day one summer when Father worked all day building stands for the carnival. Sure enough, at the end of the carnival's stay, they had no money to pay him. And they said, well, for several years now, you've owed me money, and I think it's about time you reimbursed me for a lot of my work. You'll just have to think of something you can give me as payment and part of what you owe. The carnival owner wanted to be as fair as he could about everything, so he told Father that he would just take something. Whatever you want, just take it, and I guess it'll be all right. Just looking around first and let me know what you want. So Father looked around, and his eyes rested on a dummy doll rack. It's a type of trunk of balls, and it's a game, and he took it down, and he said, "I'll take this." So this is the way it came about that the Freeze children were the most popular ones in town for a long time with their dummy doll rack. So it's like a device for a. It's kind of like that Italian game where you toss the ball into the hole and there's like a bunch of little figures and you hit the figures and knock them down. It's that. Yeah. Like a whack-a-mole, but it's dummies. It's like straw men. It's like that. So that is the way it became about, that the Freeze children were the most popular ones in town for a long time with their dummy doll rack. The children had their own home-produced circus. It started with the dummy doll rack and grew from a sideshow like no other. They charged a penny to try 3 balls and knock down the dolls. If you could hit them square enough and hard enough to knock them down, you could get in on their circus for free. Otherwise, you had to pay 10 cents to see it. They actually got neighborhood children to pay on some occasions. Clarence Freeze put up a big tent and a small tent for the children's circus, and in the small one had their sideshow. Clarence Freeze put up a big tent and a small tent for the children's circus, and in the small one they had their sideshow. The Freeze children, of course, didn't really amount to much of anything, but it was a lot of fun for the children. Their parents, though, had kept them. Their parents thought it would keep them out of mischief. It tended to keep them fairly busy, at least, and Mother liked it that they were in their own yard, and she knew where they could be found. The boys had seen so many circuses that they were very circus-minded, and they had their own ideas as to what they wanted for their sideshow. They had made big signs for various things and small boxes to put them in. They had claws of death. This was a pair of lobster claws that had been saved from the one and only lobster the Freeze had ever eaten. When Lucinda found out that the lobster had to be dropped alive in boiling water, she never would allow another to be brought into the house. So she was okay with all the other animals being killed and then eaten, but a lobster just horrified her, yes. And then this one is the world's finest bird egg collection. It probably was the finest. No tree was too high to climb for the eggs, and they were arranged on a huge board with names written under them. Or the world's finest butterfly collection. Each butterfly was different and colorful. A big pin was stuck into its body that held it fast to the big board. But then there was Pig of Awe. This pig was the only one they owned, and had been caught at a carnival. Whoever caught the greased pig could keep it, and Clarence had caught it. The pig on display, like the other things, was just to see. The boys had used red paint to make stripes across the pig's back. It was a lot more ludicrous than awe-inspiring. And then there's Sea Diving Monster. This was a huge bullfrog the boys had been to a great deal of trouble to catch alive. They had a big sign above the tub of water. First you listen, and then you look. The noise the bullfrog made was really weird. Hear the ocean roar. This was a large seashell, and it was passed from one child to the other. When they put it up to their ears, it did sound like the ocean roaring. Dangerous Dan. This was a huge snapping turtle, named after Daniel. The one boy always poked a stick around it a bit to show how it would really bite and hold on. It was safer to stay at a distance. And then there was Prehistoric Skull. This was the skull of a cow that the boys had dug up somewhere. Biggest fish head in the world. The boys had saved the head of a 25-pound muskruggy. That's a kind of a fish. Which it was by no means the biggest in the world. It was a record catch for Father, and he was so proud of it he had it on display in one of the local stores for a few days. It became an attraction after it was reduced to just a head. Then there's African Python, a harmless and very bedraggled garter snake that was supposed python. The children would almost feel sorry for it. No one could be a performer in the circus except the Freeze children. They never allowed anyone else to take part until the day one especially pestiferous youngster that bothered them so much begging to be in the show. The boys thought it would be a fine idea to discourage him once and for all. They finally told him that they would be a part for him, and he would not need to practice, but just to come at the usual time. When it came time for his part, he was unceremoniously hauled out into the platform, and the biggest of the boys said, "You've been a very bad boy, and now your daddy has to spank you." And then he took the little fellow across the knee and began to spank him. Great. The louder the boy yelled, the more the audience laughed. It was a completed... The louder the boy yelled, the more the audience laughed. It was completed, an unrehearsed performance, and the boy kept yelling, "My pants are thin, my pants are thin." He tore out of the tent and ran home the first chance he got. Bright and early the next morning, he came back to play, as no time in saying that he never wanted to be in the show again. The boys told him that they hadn't needed a bad little boy to spank. He would have never been in it in the first place. To his credit, it may be said that he never bore a grudge and was the most loyal of friends. Oh, bats. The free circus was a lot of fun and very imaginative, and the family had many fond memories of having it. Poplar Palace. Not popular, Poplar Palace. Poplar Palace is poplars are kind of wood. The story of the Freese family growing up would not be complete without mention of the Poplar Palace, a country seat home on Turk Lake. It got the name for being surrounded by poplar trees. After a great deal of conferring with the family, they finally arrived at this and the name they wanted for their country seat, as they liked to think of the cottage at a nearby lake. It had meant a lot of hard work by all of the men in the family. No one had worked harder than Clarence, for while the boys helped with the clearing of the land, the actual labor of building the cottage fell to him. He wanted to do most of the carpentry. The cottage was not made of all new materials, but the flooring and the roofing were new, and it was a great day for the family when it was completed, and the big placard affixed above the door called the Poplar Palace. The placard was handmade by the boys and couldn't have been painted a brighter shade of red. One night, a small cyclone blew the roof off the top of one of the more important outbuildings, and there wasn't anyone quicker to take advantage of the situation than the younger two brothers, Roy and Ernest. They popped a ladder up behind the building, and all day long, when anyone went to the boys, peered over the missing roof and down into the building. They weren't discovered for hours, and when they were, everyone who had been to the cottage outbuilding that day also cast a wary eye upward to see if they were still in there. They continued for many years, and even when they grew older, and they did not spy on anyone from the building anymore. The girls sometimes imagined they were there. Inside the cottage, the walls weren't furnished with any kind of wallboard, so that the studs and the beams stuck out. In the middle of the large one-room structure was a double bed with a wraparound curtain on a rail. They had put out an old grand piano in the cottage to play, and spent many times playing it, and over time it was out of tune, but never got tuned again. Out in the back, in addition to the outhouse and changing room, there was a well that kept the cantaloupes and the watermelons to keep them cool in the water, so they would be served up on hot days. Big crowds came and ate lots of food. The melons didn't stay long. If the family thought that the cottage surrounded by poplar trees was to be a haven where they could relax, fish and swim, they were greatly mistaken. Clarence enjoyed the cottage as much as the guests did, but the children were stuck with cleaning it afterward. Clarence had worked so hard that now that he could just blissfully forget anything resembling the word work, and fishing to his heart's content. His greatest pleasure was to get up at about 4 in the morning and fish for bullheads. That's a kind of fish. One meal the family cooked 55 bullheads. Yes, that's right. They were all eaten too. Bullheads are medium-sized fish with ugly stingers, and they're mudfish found in lakes. A bit like catfish. They even sting you bad if you weren't careful. Clarence rarely got stung. The family brought in an ice cream churn to make ice cream homemade for the adults, the children, and the guests. Guests came from far and near, and some of them drove as far as 200 miles to spend weekends at that cottage. They never forgot to bring along their bathing suits, but it never occurred to them to bring their own bedding or towels to get meals. The cottage was loaned to guests with the express consent they didn't need to pay for the food or the washing, so the food and the laundry bills at times were frighteningly high. Some weekends, none of the family went to the lake, and the guests took over everything. They used boats, fishing tackle, etc., and no expense, of course, to themselves, and it was such times that the Freese younger adults and old men learned lessons in hospitality from Clarence. He said it didn't make any difference if he took his last cent. A guest always must be made comfortable, and the guests certainly were. Sometimes a cottage would be found in such condition that after a weekend out of town guests, that it would take 6 or 7 hours to clean it up and put it back as soon as it should be. This is a source of great aggravation to them, the family, who turned it was to clean up the place afterward. One day, after cleaning the cottage all day, Estelle wrote a note that she tacked up on the dish cupboard. As long as the cottage lasted, the note was still there. It did not meet with Father's approval, but it did not object naturally or remove it. It read, "I am the free, proud country seat, and I like to be clean and neat. Please don't leave me all dirty and must, for if you do, you will be roundly cussed." Things improved when that was on. Note, the Poplar Palace stayed intact until Estelle Fries was married and then was known as Estelle Brown, and had children of her own. Still, the siblings also had children that spent time there. Her children, Martha and Robert, that'd be my father and my aunt, remembered the cottage well, and that it still stood on the edge of the lake as a vacation spot as late as the 1920s and 30s. Robert Brown, my father, recalled the details of what was in the cottage at the time. He remembered it from when he was a boy. It only had one outbuilding, and when he saw it, he spent a summer or two there. The cottage burned down in 1960. Clarence Fries was very proud of a few possessions: his gun collection and his dogs. He had a specially built cupboard for the guns, and he had the single and double-barreled shotguns of 10, 12, and 16 and 20 gauge. Each of the boys had their own Winchester rifles. It's kind of like the Old West, so yeah, of course it did. And they all went down hunting every winter. Daniel, Lee Oliver, Roy, and Ernest were included, and when they reached the age of 10, could have a gun. They also hunted ducks, partridges, quail, pheasant, etc. At 10 years of age, each of the boys were allowed to go hunting by themselves, which included tramping many miles through the woods and setting up duck blinds also. My goodness, I guess back then they were a little more... yeah, okay. The dogs were used for occasion, and Clarence would never have parted with one of his beautiful dogs. He had a pointer that he believed was unlike any in the world. It stalked game, and it stood like a statue, and raised one paw in the scent of game. The dog also impressed people that they would comment on its skills if they saw it in action. Then there was a retriever, which father and his son took whenever they went duck hunting. The retriever never missed a duck. When they went out on the boat with the dog and shot the dog would bring it back. The remarkable thing about that is when it carried the duck with its teeth, there were no tooth marks on the bird when they got it back. Clarence would rent a gun and a dog to a friend who wanted to use them, and sometimes he even rented them to strangers who had stayed on to the local hostelry for the weekend. It's like a house. Yeah, bread and breakfast kind. Such as traveling salesmen who were on the road a lot. Father had at least 3 hound dogs at all times. One was especially valuable to him. He thought that most of it was a long-eared dog. Okay, wait a minute. He thought so much of this long-eared dog that when he was offered $150 for him, he just laughed at the idea. One Sunday, he rented a gun for 50 cents to a stranger, and when he was asked if he could also rent the dog, he said for 50 cents extra, he could also rent a dog. That was the understanding that both the gun and the dog were returned before dark and in good condition. That evening at dusk, the stranger returned all right, and it was then that he made his offer of $150 for the dog. Clarence shook his head and said, under no circumstances are any of his dogs for sale. Early the next morning, the stranger came back, and he was so affable and apparently beyond suspicion that Clarence again rented him a gun and the same dog. Clarence never saw the man again, and he inquired everywhere about him. Oh shit, he stole his dog and his gun. Probably to do something criminal. The ticket agent at the train depot said, "Yeah, I seen a man get on the train, and he checked the dog to a certain destination." The agent didn't know which place the man went to. After checking his books with the authorities, they never turned up. It was to be assumed that the dog had been taken to the far north deer country, and Clarence said ruefully that it would have to have been awfully far indeed, or the dog would have found his way back somehow. He never lent his guns or dogs out to strangers again, not without the best of references. Clarence Fries had a high buggy and a fairly good horse, but the family was so large that when they wanted to go for rides, there wasn't enough room. So Clarence bought a surrey. Though it had no fringe on the top, it did have 2 seats. So some of the children rode on the seat in the back, and a couple more sat on the floor at their feet. So it's like a stagecoach. No, a bit high buggy stagecoach. Yeah, soon Father thought that he should have a pair of horses instead of the one only. So he started looking around with the idea, I think it's an open stagecoach. Soon Father thought that he should have a pair of horses instead of the one only, so he started looking around with the idea of acquiring one more horse, or a pair of them. One day at the livery stable he made a deal for a pair of nags. A sadder-looking pair of nags was not found in the world. The owner of the stable said he needed a watch, and since one thing Clarence loved to do was to swap out things for one thing for another, accumulated 5 watches, some good and some not so good. He traded a watch for the horses, or as the owner said, they were so old that he was on the verge of shooting them. He felt it was his lucky day when Clarence came along and made the agreeable swap. When Father came home with the horses and called Lucinda to see them, she was so dismayed that it was impossible to be pleased about it. And she said to Clarence if he'd carry the horses. She asked Clarence, "Did you carry the horses home?" And he laughed and said, "Well, you can tell a horse's age by its teeth, and they still have some." Mother stuck her head doubtfully and wondered whether the horses had cost much of anything at all. She never knew what to expect with Clarence. When he told her he had swapped a watch for them, she said, "What, was it an Ingersoll?" And then they both had to laugh and thought that they would make the best of the bargain. After all, there isn't much else to do. Father decided the horse should have funny names, so he had them have something to take pride in. After thinking it over, he decided to call them Uncle Sam and the Goddess of Liberty. Lucinda, though, thought there was nothing short of sacrilege, and said so. Clarence defended his idea by telling her again that the horses had to have something to live up to. Well, I don't remember the horses, but I remember stories about the horses. Yeah, they're glue, a long time ago. Since they were obviously decrepit, maybe it would do some good to call them by those names. They were all given many other names before their demises, which wasn't very long after that. Later, Clarence said, well, the watch wasn't much good either. Ingersoll watches at the time were very cheap, and so were the horses. That's what happened with the swap for the 2 pathetic horses. Remember this grandma story? And adding a note in during this editing that Ingersoll watch still exists and makes timepieces, and they've improved a little since the time of the last century. I think they were sold to a Japanese company or something after English. It was originally Dutch. Yeah, so they kind of like sold to somebody else. And yeah, they make better watches now than they did. Back then, they were crap. They were like blessings deferred. Christmases at the Freese residence were nothing short of marvelous, and were long remembered by all of the family. First, Clarence needed to go out and find a good tree. The woods were full of them, and they were wonderful. Big Michigan balsams, pines, and other trees were good for Christmas trees. All that time, no one bothered to check as to who owned the woods, and Clarence Freese had made a vow with himself that no one in town could have a taller and more beautiful tree than his family. The only place a taller tree could be seen were at the churches. Father's had to be the next tallest and be searching the woods until he found one that he considered perfect and cut it down and would drag it through the snow. His trees were never less than 8 feet tall and was unusually bushy and perfectly shaped. It was nothing at all to Clarence to drag a tree as far as 7 miles through the snow, and if it was snowing or a blizzard, it was nothing to him. Although his back might be nearly breaking and his arms aching, he always entered his yard with his prize with shining eyes and a light heart. The children spent many happy hours making the trimmings. Rows of popcorn were strung on the strings, and the children were allowed to make their own popcorn balls. Those were colored red and green and pink, and they were carefully wrapped with red ribbon and hung on the tree. The town had very few store ornaments, and the children thought that anyone who had them must be very rich. Clarence made wire fasteners and real small candles, which were placed all around on the tree. As soon as it was dark, Clarence made a great ceremony of lighting the candles himself. Then he administered each and every one to be careful of the candles. Then, as soon as they were all lit, the family joined hands, young and old, and sung all the Christmas carols they knew. Since they knew them all sung them in triple F triple fortissimo, which is very loud. It was suspected that they were heard within a 3-block radius. The youngest children were told and believed that they were singing to God, and that he heard them, and that he was glad. After the singing, the whole family sat down and ate oyster soup with as much gusto as they had sung. They never did anything quietly. They had a big Christmas Eve supper later, and when they returned from church, as soon as they had finished the oyster soup, they all hurried and dressed up in their very best clothes, and everyone went to the Christmas program at church. Nobody was too young or too old to go. The whole family looked forward to the church service. As a rule, there were printed programs furnished for each as they came in, which was usually too long, and inadvertently several frees were on the program. It seemed every child had a piece to speak or a song or to sing. Usually, the grandparents stayed awake long enough to know that they had heard their little darlings, and then they happily went back to their business of head nodding and restlessness. It was not unusual to hear someone snore, or even at the mostly unnoticed, and no one cared. The minister read the beautiful story of the 3 wise men, and gave a little talk on the meaning of Christmas. The congregation sang Christmas carols, at which the priests joined in, eagerly, despite the fact that they already sing all earlier in the evening at home. At the end of the program, there was a Santa Claus with a necklace of bells around his neck, and a huge pack on his back, which nearly bent him double by the time he reached the stage. He cheerily called a Merry Christmas to everyone, and took charge of the distribution of boxes of candy. Each and every one in the audience, including babies in arms, received the candy. The custom of going to church on Christmas Eve was so entrenched in the minds of the children that they surprised that most people in later years who did not know what Christmas to do. I also let it be known that, before I go on to that next part, let it be known that it wasn't that the fat Santa Claus with the St. Nick thing wasn't until a New York parade in 1934, plus the plot of a movie, Miracle on 34th Street, was 1934 to 39, was actually when Santa Claus we know today was Santa Claus. This is Santa Claus before that. This is the St. Nick one. He cheerfully called a Merry Christmas to everyone and took charge of the distribution of boxes of candy. He cheerfully called a Merry Christmas to everyone and took charge of the distribution of boxes of candy. Each and every one in the audience, including the babies in arms, received the candy. The custom of going to church on Christmas Eve was so entrenched in the minds of the children that they were surprised that they met people in later life who didn't know what to do on Christmas. They learned that some people liked to drink a lot of liquor, and they felt sorry for those who did. When the house had finally calmed down to a semblance of quietude, the stockings were mysteriously filled with the entire household was supposed to be asleep. The children knew the only thing that they could touch under the tree were the stockings. So they therefore looked for them in the morning. And one by one sneaked down the stairs and found the stockings with their names on it, and took it to bed with them. It was so cold that they had a marvelous time pulling all the contents of the stockings under the covers. Always there was one little toy, an apple, a banana, an orange, peanuts, or candy. As these things were taken from the stocking, they were eaten until nothing but the toy was left. The children had to stay in bed until 8 in the morning, when they were called as soon as the house was warm enough. They always insisted they didn't want any breakfast. Their eyes were hungrier than their stomachs, and they cast many longing glances at the tree, under which was piled many fascinating shapes and various sized packages. Lucinda insisted that everyone had to sit down on the breakfast table, where they ate anything or not. Lucinda insisted that everyone had to sit down at the breakfast table, whether they ate anything or not, regardless of their restlessness. Clarence went ahead and asked for the blessings, and he always did. Despite the fact that the children were full of candy and fruit, they had to sit and watch the grown-ups eat. It was not until after breakfast that the presents were distributed. A very fussy Santa Claus insisted on reading the names, and so deliberately the children became increasingly restless. Then they all began talking at once until Santa's voice could rarely be heard above the din. Finally, in desperation, he began screaming at the top of his lungs. No one noticed Grandpa was missing, thought it strange that his presents were put aside. After all, the presents were distributed and being opened. No one noticed that Grandpa was missing, or thought it strange that all of his presents were put aside. After all, the presents were distributed and being opened. And then when Santa Claus left, Grandpa would come back. But no one noticed how tired he looked, or hoarsely he talked, except the grown-ups. The children never caught on, either. One week in the winter, there was to be a big supper at the church to be held at a cold Friday night. Back when we came for breakfast, we considered the same as out west. But dinner was actually lunch, and supper, for us, was what they called dinner. All of the families were to sit together and bring their supper in baskets. It was to be a sort of potluck, and the families usually exchanged All of the families were to sit together and bring their suppers in baskets. All of the families were to sit together and bring their suppers in baskets. It was to be a sort of potluck. And the families usually exchanged foods, and although they each brought their own, the neighbors always tasted better. Everything was all set out on the long table, family style. The church furnished the coffee, and the sugar, and the dairy supplies, and all the cream. That same thing happens in our church. I guess we're similar. Yeah. Well, Grandma Knapp was there in the beginning of that, so that's why. Exactly. Lucinda was always expected to bring 3 huge pots of baked beans, as this was her specialty, and everyone far and wide praised her prowess in fixing them. Beans, the musical fruit. Yep. As the week drew near to a close and Friday was only 2 days away, the weather began to change. Snow plows had cleared the roads and schools were to be opened the following Monday. Lucinda talked it over with Clarence and the children. She wondered how she could get to the church. She was not well enough to walk as far as the weather was so Lucinda talked it over with Clarence and the children, and she wondered how she could get to the church. She was not well enough to walk so far as when the weather was so damn that word. Inclement, yeah. Lucinda talked it over with Clarence and the children, and she wondered how she could get to the church. She was not well enough to walk so far as the weather was so inclement. At the time, they had no car or horse or sleigh. Clarence told her not to worry about a thing, as he guaranteed that she would go, and he was very secretive. Just how was he going to accomplish this? When everyone else seemed this was an insurmountable undertaking. He worked in the cellar by the furnace until late Thursday night, and still said nothing as to what he was doing. When it came time to go to the church, the family was ready and waiting to go with their baskets of food. The snow was falling heavily, and Lucinda still had trepidations to her heart, and felt her fears that she couldn't get to go. And it was important to her to be there, so it was a weekly occasion, and no one missed unless they were ill or in bed. Father told all of the family to go on ahead, and he would follow behind Mother, and he still would have not revealed his big idea. When Lucinda stepped outside to go, Clarence met her in the front door with a giant-sized sled that he had made by himself. He used old sleigh runners from the sled, and it was quite the most ingenious idea. The sled that he had named Jumbo, and told Lucinda all she had to do was say, "Go, Jumbo," and the sled would take her anywhere she wanted to go. Of course, Clarence was pulling it. That helped. Lucinda was very proud, but she was so afraid someone would see her riding on her great big sled that she made Clarence go down all the back streets and all the darkest possible pathways to get to the church. She got there, and Jumbo was the pride and joy of the children for many winters to come. The children were rich enough. She got there, and Jumbo was the pride and joy of the children for many. She got there, and Jumbo was the pride and joy of the children for many winters to come. The children, when they were rich enough to have store sleds, would vie with each other to see who could trade and get to use Jumbo. Jumbo, in fact, was so popular that the children could be choosy and get to ride the most expensive sleds in town in exchange for riding Jumbo. Greenville, 1908. Roy was 14 and learning to play the violin and to bake. This seemed like a contrasting talent, but eventually he became proficient in both undertakings, and liked them equally as well. At first his violin practicing had been confined to the lower regions, and the cellar many times. It seemed like a fine idea for him to practice his awful screeches and scratches in the cellar, but the noise came up through the registers. It was just so plain awful that the children were afraid to go down there. It was decided that he should go upstairs to his room, or the attic, or to any place that was as far away as possible. Sometime after school on Saturday, Roy was employed by the various stores to work at either delivering groceries or unpacking them and stocking the shelves. He would work whenever he was He had to work whenever he was needed, and he was paid 25 cents for after school, and a whole $1 if he worked all day on Saturday. On the Saturday that Roy was not employed at the store, he stayed in the house all morning and baked 6 dozen cupcakes. Then he baked 5 pies, and his specialty was peach pie. He made his bakery so expertly that an old German cook, who was pretty expert herself, and said that he made things that tasted better than hers. He felt quite elated and made it a special point to see that she always got a sample of his wares. Ray never failed to shoo the children out of the kitchen. Oh, it should be Roy. Roy never failed to shoo the children out of the kitchen, and if possible, one of the house altogether when he was going to bake. His greatest pleasure was after all the cupcakes were baked and cooled, to frost with them the special icing. Half of them were frosted with white and the other with dark icing. The reason he especially enjoyed doing this was because all of the children by this time were watching him through the big window. Whenever he would frost a cake, he would show them how he could drizzle the frosting into his throat. He made a special point of holding each cake up as it was to be frosted and let them see it. As he would spread the frosting on and keep watching them out of the corner of his eye, he's sure they were secretly jealous of him. In spite of the fact that 6 dozen cupcakes and 5 peach pies were baked every Saturday, it wasn't enough for the hungry household, as there were 12 loaves of bread brought from the bakery, and yet there was never a crumb of anything left to eat by Monday morning. Roy got very good at playing the piano, also, and played with his siblings in a family band affectionately called the Agony Concert Company. The Freese were all musically inclined, and besides having an organ to learn to play, there was also now a piano. This was greatly admired by all the family and their friends. The older sister, Pearl Esther, ever being the aggressive side, had located a piano teacher who offered to give her a piano lesson every Saturday for 25 cents. She walked the long blocks for her lessons each Saturday afternoon, and promptly came home and gave the same lesson to her 2 younger sisters. So it was that the children who wanted them had piano lessons 3 for a quarter, and the original teacher never knew her wares were so cheaply sold. Being quite a philanthropist in her own right, she probably would not have been disturbed. And she found out. The fact is, the piano teacher played the organ in the Methodist Church for 25 years and was a highly reputable teacher and very fine artist. Those in the family who did not play the piano played the violin, the cornet, the clarinet, and the trumpet. The one who was the least musically inclined pounded on a drum, which could seldom be silenced because that person was so enthusiastic. The drummer was blissfully indifferent to the fact that music was often told to, in uncertain terms, that he was not the soloist, and many lively arguments ensued. When the family got together nearly every evening and Sunday afternoon to practice, they called themselves the Agony Concert Company. If the neighbors had not been so kind, it is to be suspected that they would only too vociferously have agreed the name was appropriate. The children all learned music the hard way, i.e., by the criticism of the older ones who had teachers. And more often than not, the criticisms were to be the most scathing kind. Many hours were spent in practicing between arguments as to correct time, phrasing, and how long the rest to be, and other things. It was a cardinal sin to not be together, and woe to anyone not counting time correctly. Every Saturday evening for many years, the Freeses ended their concert by singing hymns, and younger and older joined in them. Their favorites were never pianismo or PPP, as that sign was gleefully ignored. That means soft. Pianismo. They all sang FFF triple fortissimo, as in Onward Christian Soldiers, for the finale. Only the soldiers marching would have made more noise. So, fortissimo is loud. It was bitterly cold in Michigan one season, and the temperature was 25 degrees below zero. A high white blizzard had come, and snow was piled high everywhere, making the roads there impassable. Even the snowplows couldn't get through. The schools were closed until the streets could be cleared, and although it was only a temporary arrangement, the children hoped it would be permanent. They enjoyed making big snowmen much more than they did making marks for themselves as students. The big house where the Freeses lived had a rather inadequate heating system. Father, in fact, had built in the furnace, and it only heated the 4 rooms in front, necessitating the use of a big coal-burning stove, very strange in the kitchen. It took half a day before the house was reasonably warm, and then everyone was obliged to wear long, part-wool underwear and big, heavy sweaters. The fires died down so low at night until sometimes there was no fire at all. When the fire in the furnace died a lingering death, everything in the house froze, and all the plants, the water pail, were frozen solid. The children had to undress one at a time behind the big base burner in the dining room, and each one was ready to go upstairs to bed, and was required to get a towel and wrap it around a heated brick, which was waiting in the kitchen range. The brick was taken to bed with them, and they would slowly move it around the sheets until they nearly froze standing up. Then they would crawl into bed with the brick at their feet. It was exactly like sleeping out of doors. It was so cold. In the morning it was a common practice to scrape snow off the bed as it was seeping through the windows. Every morning, when Clarence woke up, his mustache was covered with little icicles. The children's eyelids were usually stuck fast, and they couldn't open them until they were taken care of. Despite this weather, there was no work for a carpenter. Needless to say, the scarcest article around the house was ready cash. A great deal of time and thought went into expenditures, as the money of even the smallest denomination was counted and recounted. It was decided that when a certain thing was indispensable, it must be purchased. But that thing never stayed in their minds long. The notion of having a new thing would be discarded, and something more urgent would come up for discussion. Lucinda spent many hours a night worrying as to how she could properly dress the children, or schools should reopen. They needed so many things like underwear, warm sweaters, stockings, overshoes, mittens, and the list became long, as did the night. One evening during the cold snap, as it was called, Lucinda and Clarence stayed up late and tried to solve their problems. The more they thought about how many things they needed to buy and how little money there was with which to buy them, the more discouraged they became. It was at such a crucial time, and there had been many of them, that they began wondering to each other if we had been better off if they had not had so many children. They would never convince themselves that they had even one child they could spare, of course. They knew if their hearts were that if anyone had $1 million left offered to take one of their children, then it would be impossible to choose one that they could spare. It was then that they decided to go take a look at the children, as they bundled themselves up in under their heaviest coats, and both went upstairs where the children were all fast asleep. They went first from one bed to the other, and from one room to the other, and looked down at the faces of their sleeping children. Clarence carried a lamp, and it was so cold it was nearly frozen to his hand. When they got back downstairs and then to huddled around the kitchen range, then it was the time that they brought their voices to their thoughts. Mother spoke first. "Clarence, sometimes I think we have so little, and yet we have so much. Which one could you spare, Clarence?" "Well, Lucinda," Father replied, "you must know my answer to that. I can spare the same one you can." And then they knew neither of them could spare any of them, and they thanked God for all of them. And then they both thought that when the children should be grown, they would indeed be blessed. Father said, "Just think, when they're all grown up and when they will have to do their own worrying, and we won't have to wonder what they will wear or what they will eat. It'll seem strange. Yes, Lucinda, we will have our own blessings fulfilled and attained when they are all on their own. But just now, we must wait and have those blessings deferred." Note, they loved the children. Chickens get drunk during Prohibition. Greenville, summer 1910. The Frees were teetotalers, which meant they lived in the Prohibition and did not drink alcohol. Lucinda was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement in town and made president of the organization not long before. Each and every child, as he or she reached the age of 7, was taken into a room all by his or herself and given a lecture on temperance. Lucinda made it her business to see that she talked to her girls. Clarence likewise felt that it was duty to instruct the boys all about the evils of drink. Since the children had never tasted anything in their short lives except milk and water, it may have seemed some like a very unnecessary and perhaps even idiotic procedure. But the Frees were adamant in their dread of the demon rum, as they disliked all drinking. And they could not get to start the children out too young to hear about the evils of demon rum. A great sized sheet of paper was printed with a little verse that each child was required to memorize. When they could say it perfectly, they were given a pen and told that the paper was to be signed. And all the grown-ups in the family listened as they recited the verse and watched as they signed the paper. It would delight the executives of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement and Union to know that the verse of the children legend and pledge that they signed at 7 was as follows: "I am a little boy or girl just 7 years old, and I love temperance better than gold. Touch not, taste not, and handle not the wine. Every little boy or girl like me in the temperance pledge should sign." The children were told that even to drink a bottle of beer was almost as bad as to rob a bank. They could not be the story of This could not be the story of Clarence Freese without mention of the fact that he was a teetotaler in more ways than one. 2. He not only was dead set against liquor, he also had never smoked, and he never swore or used vile language. He took very seriously his position as a father and told anyone that he would listen. He took very seriously his position as a father, and he told anyone who would listen that he felt as if he had to be an example to his children. He not only preached temperance, he practiced it. The year was 1910, and Lucinda was president of the local version of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And the children incident involves an embarrassing day for her, involving elderberries, chickens, and sobriety. The weather was extremely hot in Greenville that summer. Had Estelle found the courage to look at a thermometer, she would have been comforted by a reading of 105 Fahrenheit, and instantly would have felt hotter. The oldsters declared that they had never known it to be so hot on all the years they had lived in the state. As the thermometer climbed to 107 Fahrenheit, if one was on the street, he might come across a farmer venturing out for supplies who didn't see at least discomforted by the heat. Estelle was 14 years old and was sent downtown to buy some sugar for canning. Estelle met a farmer who had ventured into town for supplies, and he said that he didn't mind the heat, as it was good for his corn. Then he laughed and said it didn't seem to improve anyone's disposition, and everyone he'd met so far looked witted and talked of nothing but the heat. In the small town where we lived, Lucinda was greatly respected by the townspeople. Besides having 9 children and a big 14-room house, she found time to entertain with monologues at the local Grange Hall on sobriety. She prided herself on the fact that no beer or liquor had ever crossed her threshold, as she expressed it. Yeah, so I guess when Dr. Beck drank, he drank outside. Yeah. She was such a teetotaler that it would never have crossed her mind that she could have accidentally intoxicated anything. She was mortified that people drank, and wanted people to be teetotalers like her. Then what happened that hot summer day made her look a little foolish, and embarrassed her to no end. That August day was much too hot to can fruit. But what could she do when the kitchen was piled high with freshly picked raspberries, boxes and boxes of them, some red and some black? Lucinda looked at the raspberries and sighed. She was glad that she had help, but still was no small task to get the fruit from the boxes to the kettles, and then into the jars, where they were yet boiling hot. Canning was a necessity as ironing as any other household task that needed to be done, as is attested by the large amounts of various fruits grown in the backyard, and the hundreds of jars eaten in the winter time. Yes, it seemed to be one disliked task after another, and one wondered if there would ever be an end to it all. The supposition was that everything properly had to come to an end sometime, but then never seemed to end to work. She made her way very leisurely to the fruit cellar to check up on her empty jars. Anyway, she thought, it might be cooler in the cellar, and it certainly couldn't be any hotter the way she felt at the moment. Reaching in behind some empty jars, she had touched several jars that seemed to be filled with something. She lifted it out and took it by way of the window, where the light was better. It looked like a jar of elderberries, and it was very, very spoiled. She looked carefully at the date on the jar. And it was dated Elderberries, August 1905. She went back and found that there was 8 more jars of spoiled berries, which had been canned 5 years before. No wonder they spoiled, she thought. Being way in behind there, they got missed, so I'll have to throw 'em out. She then began to wonder if chickens liked elderberries, spoiled or not. But not knowing the answer to her question, she decided to pour the spoiled berries in the big pan in the chicken coop. She figured if the chickens didn't like them, they would just leave them alone, or no harm would be done. At this time, Lucinda only had about 50 chickens. At one time, she had 300, but began eating them when it was decided that it was too expensive to buy the extra feed necessary to raise them from baby chicks. Chickens, it seemed, were always hungry, but her 50 chickens seemed to thrive on anything in the line of food. Things often were thrown to them, which no self-respecting chicken would ordinarily eat. They didn't seem to find, and they ate odds and ends of almost anything imaginable. It was quite a while before she checked to see if the chickens had liked this latest treat she had poured into their big pan. The chickens had obviously eaten a lot of the berries, and so many of them were gone. She first noticed that the pan was nearly empty, and that she looked at what had been her beautiful white leghorns. That's a kind of foghorn leghorn from Looney Tunes, yes. He's a leghorn. But yeah, that ain't out yet. This is only like 1910. So yeah. Yeah, so the chickens had obviously eaten a lot of the berries, so many of them were gone. She first noticed that the pan was nearly empty, and then she looked at what had been her beautiful white leghorns. What she saw was most bewildering. Never were chickens such a pretty color. They had splashed the gorgeous purple elderberry juice all over themselves, and she thought they looked almost attractive in their purple-tinged white feathers. Looking closer, she thought that she must have been seeing things. The chickens were not acting right. They appeared neither normal or natural. They were wobbling around, some first on one leg and then the other. Some were falling down and rolling around on the ground. Some were weaving and some looked sick. And all of them looked about ready to die. Oh. What in the world is the matter with my chickens? Lucinda thought. Just then she looked up toward the street in front of her home and saw Ray. Who knew the family walking by? Okay, Ray shows up again. Ray. Just then she looked up toward the street and in front of her house and saw Ray. Who knew the family walking by? She called to him and said, "Come take a look at my chickens. They're falling down and they act like they're sick or something. I can't imagine what's the matter with them." Ray came over to the coop and took a look at the chickens. Then he turned to Lucy and asked her if the chickens had been eating anything unusual. She said, "Well, I guess you could say so. All I did was pour several quart jars of fermented elderberries in their pan. As you can see, they've splashed the juice all over themselves, and a lot of the berries are gone, so they probably ate a lot of them." "How old were the berries?" this friend asked. "Well, they was spoiled elderberries, canned in 1905, which is 5 years ago. So no wonder they fermented." 5 years ago? Well, Lucy, that'd be elderberry wine. I sure wish you saved some for me. He then looked again at the chickens and started to laugh. If you want to know what's the matter with your chickens, I can tell you right now. They're drunk. Lucinda was very mortified. She had such a teetotaler that Lucinda was very mortified. She was such a teetotaler that she never considered the likelihood the chickens would get drunk because of her. She made Ray promise he would not give her away, and she wouldn't want anyone in town to know the head of the WCTU had gotten her chickens drunk. She always thought that it was so bad a job to rob a bank so as to get drunk. No. She always thought it was as bad a thing to rob a bank as it was to get drunk. Ray solemnly promised that he would never tell a soul. And he didn't, for 5 minutes. That's how long it took him to get to town and tell everybody he saw. To him, this was a very funny story, and shocking, considering that Lucinda Freese was so shocked and mortified, and knew she'd left an improper drinking binge for her chickens. In fact, the more mortified she got hearing it, the more mortified she got hearing it, the funnier it got, until she just gave up and started telling the story as a humorous, embarrassing moment. This story is funny. I hope that someday in the distant future, when we have like great-great-grandchildren, that they put this out in some big city somewhere and put it on display. Clarence. Maybe a moving picture or something. That time flies. Ooh. Greenville, 1911. Time for Lucinda Fries seemed to be flying as if soaring away on the wings of an eagle. She never had a moment to which to relax to think. If she did have her moments of meditation, were spent on her home problems and her children, rather than on Clarence or herself. Their life together seemed to be so wrapped up in the affairs of their family that it was as if they were indeed one. The changes wrought in the added years to the children's lives were evidenced as all that was around her. The little village in which she had grown up was a village no longer. It was incorporated as a city, and while it was very small in size, it was very progressive in its thinking. It seemed that Lucinda and Clarence, as the city grew, so did the children with it. And as they increased in stature, so did everything all around them. The town had many schools, churches, and industries. Grand Rapids, the big city, had fast become the furniture center of the world, and they were very proud of this nearby city, as well as the little Greenville where they lived. Modern improvements came about so rapidly everyone found himself or herself marveling at each new miracle. First the railroad, the invention of the telephone, and electricity. They could remember when there was no such things, and now they were becoming common. Just something everyone had a matter of course, and appreciated less as they went on. It seemed everyone accepted each new miracle in his stride, and they would stay along themselves, as if nothing could surprise them. Clarence had his house wired for electricity, and the modern improvements with the rest of them. His big house seemed smaller as time went on. Frugality was a virtue, and no one had a lot of money, and no one seemed to want a lot of it. What they wanted was peace and happiness for themselves and their families and a decent living. This is what they had. Children always found their parents home with them in evening, and there was no such thing as a child with a door key around his neck or her neck. As a point of fact, few of the homes were ever locked, and there was never a time when a back door was locked. Clarence used to laugh a lot about that. As if anyone mentioned the matter of the unlocked doors, although their doors were the same, he would say, "Well, the only thing I have of any value is my family. I can't imagine anyone coming and stealing the children. Can you?" The home was very important to both young and old, and those in between. It seems a way of life, which is not gradually, but fast disappearing from the American icon. The family prayed and did blessings each time that they ate at the table and thanked God for the security he afforded them. Few parents could provide in those times everything that their families needed, but the Fries family managed to survive by the grace of Christian living. Note, Estelle does not go into her teen years at all, but rather mentions the years of her siblings. Greenville, 1916. Olive Lillian Fries had grown up and gone to a distant city to continue her piano studies. Pearl Esther Fries, her sister, had first given her lessons. Then as she grew older, and there was more money coming in, she was allowed to take lessons from a very fine teacher, who just started a career for herself after graduating from one of the country's finest musical colleges. By that time, Olive went to musical college herself, and she was already quite an advanced pupil. Upon her graduation from the musical college, she turned to the profession of teaching piano, and had at one time about 35 pupils. She said she had to have so many that in order to know that she had any, as they were so irregular about coming in for their lessons. One day, she sent the following letter home to her mother, Lucinda, and her father, Clarence. "Hi, folks. You'd be surprised to hear from me once again, as I bet you're wondering what in the world happened to me as I've been unable to write so long. I hope you didn't worry too much, and you'll never guess in a million years what happened to me or whether I've been. I've just released yesterday, and I'm not back in my rooming home. Boy, was the landlady mad at me. Don't get too excited when you hear, as I was just been released from the pest house, a contagious disease hospital. Believe it or not, the doctor said I had the smallpox, and they stuck me in there. I don't think I had the smallpox at all, but the doctor said I did. My landlady was mad because the police were out to her house and told her she would have to fumigate my room and everything, and then she even had to put up new wallpaper. What happened was I went to a piano lesson, and this girl's mother called me up on the piano. Well, what happened was that I went out to give a piano lesson, and this girl's mother called me up on the phone, and she said her daughter wasn't too sick to take her lesson, but she was too sick to come in and take it. And, well, when I get there, Well, I made the long trip to 2 streetcars, and boy did they have a small home. Well, this girl had some spots on her face, and had wondered what had happened to her mother, assured me that by saying, "No, don't be afraid, my little girl just had the chicken pox, and you needn't worry." Well, this girl had some spots on her face, and I wondered what she had, but her mother answered me by saying, "Now, don't be afraid, my little girl just has the chicken pox. And if you already had them, you don't need to worry." I told her I didn't know, but I guess I had it when I was a kid, so I gave the girl her lesson. And naturally, she was to sit on the stool right beside me. Well, later, when I broke out with the same spots, the doctor said I got the smallpox, and he railroaded me into the pest house, and I couldn't do a thing about it. I was very sick, but I was sure awful mad. You know what? All we girls who went to that music school got the habit of going to real good concerts, and they let us usher in so we have to pay those big prices to get in. Well, I thought she was on good terms, and I want to meet her. So I went right up to her and her concert, and I introduced myself. I told her I enjoyed her concert so much and that I was a piano teacher. Madame Schumann Hink shook hands with me, and she was just awful nice. Wow, Madame Schumann Hink. There's a famous piano lady right there. Yeah, wow, that's something. I told her I enjoyed her concert so much and that I was a piano teacher. Madame Schumann Hink shook hands with me, and she was just awful nice. Well, when I showed that Madame was vaccinated for smallpox, and if not, I hope she didn't catch it from me, and I sure broke her right after there as I shook hands with her. Oh no! You watch in the papers and see if she got it. As far as I didn't sink it yet, I love Olive. Madame Schumann Hink was a famous opera singer. Everyone had her recordings. 3 of the girls and 1 of the boys had the great pleasure of working as professional musicians at some point in their lives. They also look back upon those days as wonderful, exciting, and eventful. Estelle and Pearl sang, and Olive taught piano. Roy played the violin throughout his life and had his own dance orchestra. The little town of Greenville had not to be outdone by other towns of its size, and soon as it became the rage, it had 2 silent movie shows. Pearl was hired to sing for the still pictures, and she was so afraid she wouldn't get a job, she applied to both movie houses at the same day. The result was that they'd heard her sing, and they both hired her. In order to keep both jobs, the managers of both shows arranged to have the movie going on in one while the stills she sang were going on in the other. Because back then you had to play the music, see, for the movie, because they didn't have soundtrack, so you literally play the soundtrack on the piano. It's literally what they were doing for the performance. But yes, in order to keep both jobs, the manager of both shows arranged to have the movies going on in one while the stills she sang were going on in the other. She would run across the street back and forth to sing at both shows. Since they were just across the street from each other, it saved the day for her as well as both shops. Olive played the piano for several months at one movie house, and she was not in a position to see the screen as the piano was directly under it. During one very exciting picture, the villain was soundly thrashing the poor little tragic child. And all through the procedure, the piano was playing. He was tying her to the tracks, of the train tracks. He's going to tie the villain, tie her up, but the funny thing was that she was given the wrong music. So she was playing "I Love You Truly" and "Let Me Call You Sweetheart," and it was not until after the movie that the piano was moved to a more strategic spot. However, at the time, it caused the director to laugh. Note that the period of history, later called the Roaring Twenties, begins, although again, very little of it is mentioned. Estelle Fries opens for a musical legend. On the Road, 1920-1921. When Estelle Fries was grown up, she went to a distant city and applied at several booking agencies for a booking as a singer. She was given a contract and signed up for the Chautauqua Circuit, a classical musical troupe. A touring troupe, yeah, like a barbershop. Like a barbershop, but more like a musical circus. Not a circus, a musical touring group. Yeah, that's what it was. Chautauqua Circuits. Yeah. In those days, before radio or television, or just the beginning of radio. Actually, radio was around. In those days, at the beginning of radio, but before television, there were a few kinds of entertainment. So professional troupes would go to cities and towns to perform for folk. Joining the circuit proved to be an invaluable experience. Estelle had taken piano, violin, and vocal lessons for over 5 years, and her training at home had stood her in good stead. Actually, Estelle could play by ear and play by all the different notes and things, and she was actually a prodigy. But yeah, she didn't write that in the story, but she was actually a prodigy. She could play, if you wanted to play a song for her in the piano and you wanted to get it right in the right key and everything, she'd figure out what key you were playing in, and she'd be, oh, this is your key, this is what you're playing in. You're a tenor, or you're a soprano, or you're what. She was a prodigy. But yes, she didn't consider herself a prodigy, but she totally was. She hit pitch, that perfect pitch. Perfect range. But yes, it's one thing she was really, really good at, was doing musical instruments. Okay, so just thought I'd point that out. Grandma Knapp was really good. Estelle had taken piano, violin, and vocal lessons for over 5 years, and training at home had stood in good stead. The performances involved many hours of practicing, and there had always been plenty of criticism. She wrote home that she felt strange to be paid for singing, since there was nothing she liked to do better. She said it was like being paid to eat cake and ice cream, and was wonderful. It was at this time that in Greenville that the mailman was very busy indeed, because there were many letters being delivered to the Freese family. One of the letters begins as follows. Hi, folks. This is from your new professional musician, and here I am way out west. You know, music, you always said you showed off your educational lessons at the Grange meetings. That if you could speak pieces that made people cry, you felt you were a success. Well, you'll be glad to know that your daughter is a musician. That is a criterion. For another take from my adventures as a musician. It isn't easy to get a booking as a pro musician. There's an old saying that to get ahead of any profession, it's more important who you know than what you know. If you want to be a plant superintendent, then marry the boss's daughter. But back in the year 1920 in Chicago, if you wanted to get a booking as a singer, violinist, or a pianist, it was highly necessary to have a background in music and be able to produce and project what you know. Audiences were a fickle lot in my language, and you can be praised as high heaven one week and then ridiculed and forgotten the next week. Oh, yeah. It behooves me to develop a so-called thick skin and remain as aloof as possible from adverse publicity, she said. When you have an audition before a group of producers, you know that there are others who can do better than you can. And conversely, there are many who cannot do as well. Therefore, you just do your very best and trust that you will be selected for whatever it is you're anxious to be, as well as trained to do. What stood me in good stead was first taking a job as a receptionist and stenographer for the booking agent. The agent set up the auditions, and I was told it should be a job if I especially would like it was available for me first. That's the reason I auditioned for a job with several others and was hired to go from Chicago to Tulsa, Oklahoma with a 5-piece orchestra and an extra lady who was a professional yodeler. In those days, yodelers were much in demand and were few and far between. Our orchestra was in play from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. to an elegant restaurant where a special stage had been designed and made for orchestras. It was quite high and off the floor. My contract called for me to be the singer, and I was to take a lot of my own music with me. And also, it was my contract that I was to play the violin when I was not singing. We were told the orchestra was to be paid every week for over a 3 weeks engagement, for about $300 a week, which was to be divided among us, and my salary was to be $35 a week, plus train tickets, hotel accommodations, etc. So he wanted me to could keep it all of the 30. So if I wanted to, I could keep all of the 35 for expenses, and thus was the same pay I had been getting at the office. But it meant far more to me, as it when I dreamed of doing as long as studied so long for also. The orchestra members were to meet for the first time at the Union Station in Chicago at the ticket office. When I arrived at the station, it was easy to tell what the others were, as there were musical instruments with them, and briefcases with them. This one yodeler did not carry an instrument. We introduced ourselves to each other, and the manager of the company handed us our tickets. We were pleased to see what we had first cast Pullman tickets, entitling us to a berth, and we had to ride all night on the train. As soon as we arrived in Tulsa, we were taxied to the hotel and told to show up for a rehearsal at 10, and we had to get a program set up for the same evening. The restaurant was a separate building, but was part of the beautiful hotel complex, and we met for the rehearsal. We got to meet the owner who had hired us. It was my first engagement, but I was happy to be singing and playing violin when people were eating. I had always felt that the audience should listen when I was working. But the pianist, who was a girl from Minnesota, said it was a big mistake to feel that way, and she had to get over it, too. She had her first job playing the piano at an Edelweiss garden, where beer was served, and she thought it was terrible to drink beer. She gave me some good advice by saying that, too, when you get to a contract for an engagement, even if it's not according to your ideas, you should just put your pride in your pocket and be glad you have the job. After the first few nights, we felt our music was becoming increasingly more polished, and the eaters seemed to like us. The star of the orchestra was really this plain girl that yodeled. She didn't dress as nicely as we did, but when she got out to yodel, she was the whole room before us, not only eaten, but also eaten out of her hand, and her applause were tremendous. Had we been so inclined, we would have been jealous of her reception. Each evening became more obvious that she was the star, and we just had to like it. Estelle Fries wrote to her folks about a meeting at one of her gigs back in the 20s. This meeting was similar to many meetings of the time, and she went on about the musical circuit. Here's another one. Estelle Fries wrote to her folks about a meeting at one of her gigs back in the 20s. This meeting was similar to many meetings of the time. Estelle Fries wrote to her folks about a meeting at one of her gigs back in the 20s. This meeting was similar to many meetings of the time, as she went back on about the musical circuit. One meeting while walking across the lobby of the hotel, I noticed an elderly gentleman sitting by himself over by the windows. As I approached him, he beckoned to me to come over closer, which I did. He then said, "Are you with the orchestra next door?" And I said, "Yes, I am." "Would you do me a favor?" And I said, "Well, it depends on what it is. But if it's something I can do for you, I'll do it." "Would you please play and sing for me, 'Silver Threads Among the Gold'?" I looked around and noticed that there was a nice piano in the lobby, and also those were the only people in the room. I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to play and sing for you." As soon as I sat down at the piano bench, I turned and said, "Now I'm going to sing and play 'Silver Threads Among the Gold' just for you." I sang one verse and then the chorus and put everything emotionally into it that was in me. You might say I sang my heart out. And when I finished, I turned and looked toward the old man, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. I just quietly walked out without a word. It was the first time somebody cried when I sang. A few days later, a little boy came up to me in the restaurant and was coming down the stairs, and he said he was 9 years old and was taking violin lessons. He importantly informed me that I was not holding my violin right. He said, "My teacher said it's supposed to be held a lot higher and not sloppy." After the message, I became more aware of the fact that maybe I was getting sloppy, and I'd better watch it. When I wrote to my parents later that evening, I mentioned the two experiences I had meeting people. I said, "So far, I've met only an old man and a little boy of 9 who cried when I sang." The old man cried. The little boy didn't. Here is another letter. "Hi, folks. I thought it was time for you and your faraway daughter. You've been interested to hear that the evening dress I bought in Grand Rapids, the one I paid $50 for, is creating quite a sensation. The others in the company tell me that it's way too good to wear in this business, but I can see why. I bought it to wear, and I'm wearing it. Could be that they're jealous. I thought you would be interested that for the first time in my life I met a real count today. I've always wanted to meet a count, and here's what happened. It seemed there's a real live count on our circuit, and we understood that he'd been there for the hotel, and we would meet him. Well, we got into the lobby, and there was a very insignificant-looking man ready by the window. I wouldn't give him a second glance, and do you know that was the great His Nibs, and after we met him, we were all pretty disappointed. He's a famous lecturer, and he doesn't look at all like he knew beans, as they say in Michigan. It must be true that you can't judge a book by its cover. That makes me think I had to laugh today. You know, I had to play second violin to the orchestra and sing in the solo and soprano parts. And the girl who plays the first violin sings alto. After our concert night, a little boy came up to me and he said, "Do you know that I like to hear you sing, but I've tried and I couldn't hear you play the violin at all." He was about 10 years old. So that is how important my violin playing is so far. I've met an old man, a boy of 10, and not counting the count, it really didn't count at all. I'm beginning to wonder where all the men in between love Estelle. Estelle Fries was lost in a big city one day in the same year and came across a man named Eugene Brown, who helped her find her way, and they fell in love. And then they were married and had 2 children. Estelle Fries Brown went on to play in the early days of radio, and was on the playbill with a famous personality named Kate Smith. Note that that's, yes, Kate Smith of God Bless America. And that she was actually, yeah. And that's barely mentioned in here, by the way. Yeah, she barely mentions that. She didn't even, yeah, weird. But yeah, she barely mentions it. Ew. Here is one of my stories, which doesn't seem to be in my book for some reason. But I'll include it now. One day, while on the Chautauqua circuit, I happened upon a famous person who I was going to headline with. I was going to be the person that goes on first. He's going to go on second. So new talent was put on first, and I was going to go on second the headline. So I come up to them, and the agent man is standing there, and there's this lady in the finery, and she meets me. She come up to meet me, and she comes up and she says, "Hello, you are Estelle Fries. I am Kate Smith. Pleased to meet you, Miss Smith. I've heard you're on the radio." "Well, now you get to hear me in person. Understand you're opening for me." "Well, kid, break a leg." "Thank you, Kate Smith. It is an honor to meet you." "It's an honor to be met." And that is kind of how it probably happened. Because it's not in the story for some reason. But there it is. But that singing lady that sings God Bless America on the radio, I met her. She showed up at the Chautauqua circuits, and I headlined. Ain't that something? Well, ain't that something? Estelle's the famous one. Clarence. She done met Kate Smith. Wow, that's something else. That is something else. My goodness. She's going places, that Estelle is. That's something. When Brown met Fries. Marriage and children, 1920s. Many years later, when Estelle's daughter, Martha, was grandmother, she recounted the courtship of her mother and father to her nephew. "It was included here because Grandma never completed the part about her marriage," said her nephew Adam. "So I talked with Aunt Martha and asked her what had happened. Mother married my father after a brief 3-month courtship through mail and telephone calls. They met in Chicago in what is still called the Loop. Mom had never been to the big city like that, but a terrible sense of direction anyway. Mom was lost and was trying to find her way to a record place, but stopped in a restaurant and met an attractive man there. His name was Eugene Brown. That's Brown with an E. And he told her the directions to go to this place that she wanted to go to. You look like you're from you don't look like you're from around here. You're from out of state, I bet. I bet you how to get there. You see, it's 2 blocks up that way." Yeah, Chicago accent. I'll say it like a Chicago accent. "You look like you're not from around here. You're from out of state, I bet. I can tell you how to get there. You see, it's 2 blocks up that way." Well, she tried to go to it. However, she got lost again. Eventually, she found her way back to the same restaurant, and the handsome man was still there. He was rather bemused. "Oh, well, I guess I'll have to show you." So he did. And then he asked her out to a show, and she decided to go to a play. They didn't like plays, but went because she was a nice girl, and he wasn't able to refuse. It was the beginning of their 3-month courtship. It ended with their marriage in Greenville in January 31, 1921. It was bitterly cold in January, and the snow was piled high, to the knee. My father asked my grandfather if they should be married, and he said, "Well, as long as you love each other," or something to that effect. It was all right. So they planned to be married, and got a minister, and then they were married. And they walked down the steps of the house as a wedding aisle. So they were married, and eventually they had 2 children. Martha, born in 1923, and Robert, born in 1925. Note that the descendants of Estelle Fries Brown Knapp were able to recreate this book. Grandma and Grandpa Fries grow old. Greenville, 1930. Time was passing by rapidly. Lucinda and Clarence Fries found that the days they had reached a time in life when they lived more in the past than in the present or the future. They were alone in the big house, which seemed much larger because it was so quiet. They sat in the lonely house together. Lucinda sat before a table piled high with letters from their children, and Clarence was dozing on his Morris chair beside her. It's like a big chair. He had always been so active that he never thought that they would come, that he would enjoy just loafing around all day. But now it seemed not only desirable to loaf, but also very pleasant. 3 years ago, he went to New York, where he grew up, with some of his family. He told his grown children about his grandpa, and that he was now a grandpa for so long that it seemed that he had never been young. He had to build houses, and he used to build houses, and his homes dotted the landscape of the little town. 3 generations of Fries men had been in the trades, and one of his sons went into it also. He had 9 children, and then grandchildren, and it seemed like another time, another life, long ago, and still it felt like yesterday. As he sat in his chair, he thought of whatever happened to the old silk hat. He forgot all about it all those years after going to New York again. After 60 years, "Lucinda, what happened to the silk hat in our wardrobe?" Lucinda shook her head, her elderly gaze more than slouched over than his. "What? I don't recall what that is. I think you gave it to Daniel." "Oh, maybe I did," Clarence thought for a moment. The mailman delivered a new set of mail to the house later that day, and Lucinda added it to the pile. The pile of letters grew increasingly higher over time, and Lucinda lived there for them. Her children wrote often, and the troubles were hers, and they were mentioned, and she magnified them out of proportion. She was also fretting and stewing about some grandchildren or other. To this, Clarence just smiled indulgently, and said that she would not be happy unless she was worrying about something. She thought that even a child getting a cold was bad, but he sloughed it off. She fingered through the pile of letters, dug down into the bottom of the huge pile, and smiled as she recalled how old the letter was, and wondered why she saved it. As she sat, wow, that's a tongue twister. As she sat thinking about the children, she recalled the various stages they lived through. The family had 9 baptisms, 9 confirmations, and 9 had joined the same church. The family had 9 high school graduations and also 9 weddings, of which it created quite a flurry. Lucinda thought, when the children were small, it would be nice if they grew only a little bigger. Her health had been so poor that she had prayed to see each one of them grow up. Then, this had been accomplished, she had hoped to see them all married. She thought if the children were all married and all had homes of their own, she would be able to sit back and relax. She thought that once this happened, her blessings were no longer deferred, but had become a reality. Always in her mind, she'd been reaching for something she didn't know. It was a goal, not a set one. It was elusive, and she was always hoping to reach it someday. She wondered just what was the best years, and couldn't quite make up her mind. She had accomplished all the things that she had set out to do, because the children were all married and living on their own. She began to rethink the best years, that they were all home, small and under her feet. She wondered how she had lived through the war years, World War I, and she was very grateful that the 3 blue service stars in her flag had remained blue, and that the 3 sons that she represented all had returned home. She wondered why she should have been so blessed when she knew of one of her dearest old friends had lost the only son she had. She again fingered the letter she had saved for so many years, and read it again with a smile on her face. The letter was from about 1918. Oh, yeah, one of the husbands was one of the boys was gassed. It was Roy. Roy was in World War I in the trenches. Yeah. I don't think this is from him, though. Dear folks, it had said, this is to let you know that your sailor boy is seeing the world underneath a big battleship and not on it, as we are painting its underside, and I am helping to do it. It's a long way from seeing the world like I planned. I had quite an honor conferred on me last week, and I want to tell you about it. I played the violin at a big banquet, and afterward an old lady came up to me and said, Son, I've enjoyed your playing so much. I want to give you a present. Here is my address, and which is convenient for you to do so. Please come and call on me and have something I think you'll like. Well, the first leave I had, I went and hunted out the old lady. And when I found the place, I was so surprised I was about to fall over, and I figured it must be a joke or something. The house turned out to be a mansion, and I do mean a mansion. I had my GOB uniform on, and I didn't know what to do. You know, there are places in the United States, believe it or not, where they have signs posted that say no sailors or dogs can step on the green. Well, I walked past that place about 5 times back and forth, and finally I got enough courage to ring the doorbell. Sure enough, a butler greeted me. It's the first time in my life I've ever greeted by a butler. He took a few looks at me and said, Your name, please? And when I told him, he never changed expression. He just said, Madame is expecting you. Follow me. And when I felt kind of foolish, as I was in for it, I just followed him, and he ushered me into a great big room filled with gorgeous furniture. Way over in the corner was this little old lady. She looked awful small in that great big room. She came over to me, and we shook hands, and then you should have seen the class she had when she served what she called tea. It was a He-Man lunch, and I wasn't too nervous to fill up. Then she brought out an old-fashioned violin case and opened it, and she gave me a beautiful violin. She said, This is real old, over 200 years old. It's been in my family as long as I can remember. I'm the only one left now, and I have no use whatsoever for this violin. And I thought one day I would give it to someone who might appreciate it. I know you play, and I know you'll appreciate it. So here it is. She just gave it to me like that, and boy, is it a beauty. I knew you'd be glad to hear about it. More news next time. For your sailor boy, Roy, with love. Incidentally, this particular violin, I think that one was stolen, but he got another one later. And the other one later was from the 1900s, and we still have it somewhere. So, yeah. So that one's still around, but the one the old lady gave him is gone. Yeah. Just, you know, it's somewhere. I think the sister has it. Anyway, so, yeah. As Lucinda finished reading the letter, she began to realize what a long time ago it was since the war, and all the things that had since transpired. She wondered whether other people thought she looked old, and suddenly realized that now she and Clarence were the old folks themselves. The children's grandparents had long since departed this world. She thought about the mark Amanda and David Freese had made on them and the others. Then she felt as though her father and mother, Pastor and Mrs. Smith, were in the same room with her. Whether she thought about her father, the pastor in the same church for over 60 years, and recalled the times that he offered $5 to anyone who could read the Bible all the way through. He read it through many times himself, and shook his head sadly when early years he had only paid out the $5 to 3 people. He took their word for it when they collected the money by saying they had finished reading. He took their word for it when they collected the money by saying that they had finished completely reading the Holy Word. Yes, he'd been a good man and a dear one. Lucinda's thoughts were reverting to the big event in the near future where she and Clarence would have open house. The whole family were expected to come from far and near to the golden wedding anniversary in 1932. Big plans had started for the great event of her life, and she wondered if the 2 brothers, Tom and Harry, and 2 sisters, Grace and Maud, would be there, and had so many years since she had seen them. They were all still living, and Grace had written that she and John could be coming. For the second time in her life, she was going to see her older sister, Maud, and her husband. She visited only years before their little log cabin in the far north. Maud, her sister, had been married 50 years, too, as had Grace and the other sister, and John. And she thought of her brother, Tom, and how she had met him. And dear Tom had been married for 40 years and had raised 5 children. And the thought of her golden wedding anniversary, she was glad that the house had been so well taken care of. Clarence had dug and cemented the goldfish pond at one side of the house, and he had built benches and carved stocks in space-time. In his spare time. Clarence had dug and cemented the goldfish pond at one side of the house. That's still there. And he built the benches and carved stocks in the spare time. He was quite proud of the way it now looked, and it was planning to buy rosy ramblers for the rose arbor built above the center seats. As Lucinda Freese thought about her past, and she'd been doing a lot of thinking lately, she thought about her brothers and sisters. Lucinda Freese recalled the many visits of her minister brother, Harry Turner. Harry had many pastoral assignments, and with them many hardships. A minister's salary was extremely small, so he had to supplement his income with foodstuffs from the parishioners, including bags of produce, flour, and potatoes. He used to tell Riley of some of the missionary barrels he had received from his family, and of the dear pious ladies whose souls benefited in their donations. Some of the barrels contained shoes that didn't fit the former wearer, and fantastic dresses with feathers and furloughs, and other outdated clothing. He and his wife wondered what they were supposed to do with them. He unfailingly acknowledged the barrels with a very courteous letter, whether he could use the gifts or not. The years had taught them all that a minister's life was not an easy one, and called for a deep and abiding faith. The children grew up having known him from brief visits, and some even made letter poems for his congregation. As for her other brother and her sisters, she couldn't recall what became of them. Tom eventually stopped writing, and nobody knew what happened to him. Oh. Even though Harry kept writing, and his children did also, he didn't indicate that anything happened to Tom that he knew of. She assumed eventually that he had passed away. Maud, one of her sisters, who she met only once, had passed away. Harry notified her in a letter. The most interesting of her siblings was Grace, who she only saw twice, since she met her once in 1890, and then again after all her children were born, and all of them grown in the 1920s. To her recollection, Grace was still living, and her children had children as she had. They lost track of one another in the 20s, and never reconnected. She hoped that Harry and Grace were all right, wherever they were. The reunion of the Freeses. Greenville reunion, April 1932. April 19, 1932 was a special occasion as the Freese household because it was the date of Clarence and Lucinda's golden anniversary. It was springtime and the trees and flowers were in blossom, and the scents and sensations of spring and bloom inspired thoughts of renewal. However, in the quiet neighborhood where the Freeses lived, though the thoughts were more turned to reunion and reminiscing. The children had come home from far and near, some of them bringing their own children. They helped out in the preparation of the special event, setting up the house for the company, and Roy baked the cake, but he didn't make the cupcakes. The grandparents bought the cupcakes, but didn't have money to get very many. They didn't have a lot of money in their advanced years. 8 of the 9 children came to the party, and some of them had children. The elder Freese grandparents delighted in being with their grandchildren. Daniel and his wife Edna came with their son Edwin, and Lee and his wife Sue came with their daughter Dora Faye. Roy came with his wife Georgia, and he didn't have to travel far because he lived in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Behind them, Mary Lucille came with her husband all the way from Chicago. His name was Lee O. Nelson. Behind them, Mary Lucille came with her husband all the way from Chicago. Her name was Leo Nelson. Olive Lillian came, but with her son and daughter. Her children were adopted. Olive Lillian came, but with her son and daughter. Her children were adopted. Also, Ernest came with his wife Ida. They had 3 children, Ernest Jr., Jeanette, and Charlotte. Finally, Estelle came with her husband Eugene Brown and her children Martha and Bobby. They also came from Chicago. When Estelle Freese Brown and her family arrived, her brothers and sisters were there. It was a big event to see the folks all back with the golden anniversary, so everyone was invited. Elva wasn't there because she had moved to Washington State, out west, and was not able to attend. The anniversary reunion happened out in the warm spring sunshine. The folks, children and grandchildren and cousins all gathered from all over the country. The Freese family decided to meet outside, which was nice, because there was more room to talk. Conversation was something the family did quite well, and the chattering continued for a long time. The cakes and cookies were set out, but the old folks, Grandma and Grandma Freese, shooed away the children from them. Each one of the little cakes all had 50s made of frosting on them, so they looked quite tempting. "Those cupcakes are for the adults," Lucinda told them. The cupcakes cost a lot, and since they didn't have enough, they were for just the adults. They seemed to be grossly unfair to the younger children. Little Martha Brown, who was 9, didn't like that idea and complained, "Why can't I have a cupcake?" It was no use. There was no way she was going to get one. That's Martha. That's Martha there. Little Martha Brown, who was 9, didn't like the idea and complained, "Why can't I have a cupcake?" It was of no use. There was no way she was going to get one yet. And this is actually the future Martha Mossberger. This is Aunt Martha. Incidentally. Yeah. The family prepared fine decorations, and Roy prepared the catering and the cake. It was a nice big cake with chocolate frosting on it. And also it was to be separated into small amounts, as everyone could get some. Martha and her little brother, Bobby, didn't know why the cake wasn't for the children, and their cousins didn't get any either. Bobby was only 6, and really wouldn't recall anything about the cake at the party. Having been used to having lots of children around, the elder Freese grandparents knew how to keep their grandchildren in line. The family talked and shared their stories with each other, and had a grand time. For some of them, it had been a long time since they got together, and so they had a lot to catch up on. And the particulars of what they talked about have been lost. The reunion ended and the family went on their separate ways. Note that this was recreated using accounts from Estelle's children, Martha Mossberger and Robert Brown, over 50 years later, and isn't known if Harry Turner was at the reunion or not. Only the electric table lamp was on, and so were the elderly Clarence and Lucinda Freese. Clarence was sitting half asleep in his favorite Morris chair, and Lucinda was quietly reading to him from the large family Bible. "Surely goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our lives, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." She closed the big heavy book and looked over at Clarence, wondering if he was asleep or playing possum as usual. Once again she picked up a letter, and she received the day in the mail from her grown-up Estelle. Estelle seemed to be more and more like Clarence's long-dead sister, for whom she was named, and Lucinda pondered the first 2 lines of the long poem, which she had already read twice. "Dear old home standing in the sun, and you're ever lonesome as each day is done." Lucinda cried softly to herself as not to disturb her husband, who was so quiescent. "I am ever lonesome," she cried, and looked around the huge parlor and said, "Oh yes, I think the house and I are lonesome indeed." She had leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes and said, "It used to be home, but now it's just a big lonely house." In her mind's eye, she saw once again the children gathering around the giant Christmas tree, and she heard them singing one of her favorite songs. "Came upon a midnight clear, that glorious song of old, of angels bending near the earth to touch the harps of gold. Peace on earth, goodwill to men, peace, peace, and peace of mind. Peace of heart and peace with God. Peace on earth, goodwill to men, peace, peace of mind, peace of heart, and peace with God." She forgot the lines. Lucinda had her memories, and she lived in them. She heard singing again, and it was quite loud. At first, and then it got softer, and then finally it died down altogether. Lucinda was asleep. Clarence was trying to listen to Lucinda's voice, as memories became too much for him, and he knew he was not hearing the reading of the Bible that night. As Lucinda's voice droned on and on, although he was not listening to the words, it seemed to soften him, and then a great peace came over him. When Clarence closed his eyes, his mind's eye saw the children running up and down the stairs all around. He could always tell the children by the way their footfalls came down the stairs, and then again once more. He recalled each one by name and each individual action, smile, or word they spoke, and he could hear the lectures, the laughter, and the joy. He remembered telling Daniel about running in the house and about other instances, and then he went to sleep. The Freese parents had become grandparents and grown old, and the children were grown and gone, and only then the memories remained. Visits grew less frequent in time, and eventually only a few of them children returned. Another one compiled by Dad and I. Yeah. Because he wanted to talk about the fishing trip. The last trip. Visit to Greenville, Michigan in the summer of 1934, about a year after the incident. Clarence Freese didn't really mind that he was growing old. He retired long ago, and so he didn't think it mattered to fret about work anymore. Lucinda was still lively, complaining about the chores needing to be done, the washing, or the bills to pay. Yet she was managing all right through the depression, as were her 9 children. So let's see, she thought. What are my children doing now, she thought, about each one, with fond memories, and stirred in her a longing for it to be like it was when they were small. All of them were married, and most had children of their own. She hoped to see all of them again. The family reunion 2 years ago seemed like just yesterday. Her children had gone into many trades, including piano teaching, as Olive did, a banker, as Daniel did, and Roy went into appliance sales. He'd been gassed in World War I. But he survived. He came back. The children would make it through the lean times of the Depression, but Lucinda worried about them. The city of Chicago was in the grip of the Great Depression. The citizens were struggling to survive in the windy city, and somehow many survived the past winter. Estelle Brown offered some soup to a man in need before the family was to leave for a trip to see Grandma and Grandpa for the summer. They alternated years, going once every year or so to see the Browns and once to the Freese house or to Greenville. Eugene, her husband, didn't think it was such a good idea to travel because he didn't really get along with the old folks, and he only got a 2-week vacation. Even so, they saw a lot of each other when it came summertime every other year. Since Eugene worked on the railroad, the family got free passes to ride on the train. The family headed to Greenville at the last minute. The family headed out to Greenville in the last minute and almost missed that train. They, fortunately, made it in time to board. Once aboard the train, little Martha began chasing Bobby around the seats. The children were excited to go up to see the grandparents, so Estelle understood that they were restless. Even so, some of their antics were beginning to annoy the passengers, and they had to be told to settle down. The train ride would take about 6 hours. As the train started off, the Browns could see a line of dusty, ragged men waiting to find some money, doing odd jobs for people. A man stood on a soapbox, shouting about something inaudible, at least over the rumble of the steam train. The train ride was rather uneventful. Bobby was interested in the land and country passing by, but quickly opened a book to look at it. Martha sat quietly thinking about what she might wear for Sunday. Greenville was a long way off, and in those days it took quite a while to get there from Chicago. The trip was long and tiring, so much that when the family arrived in Greenville, they were too exhausted to really enjoy it at first. The family got into a taxicab to ride down the road to the Freese house. Quite a lot had changed since Estelle was a little girl. The automobile replaced most of the horses and buggies. Telegraph and telephone poles were strung along the main streets, and electricity in the evening. Electricity lit the evening. Estelle mused that some things remained the same, as several of Clarence's homes were still standing and looked very lived in. They still vacationed on Turk Lake, although the Poplar Palace had seen better days. The guest house was used during the family reunion 2 years earlier. As the cab pulled up to the old homestead, the engine sputtered noisily. An exchange of cash for fare money was done, and the bags unloaded. Estelle felt a wash of emotion, seeing her old home, and smiled. The brick siding needed paint, and the yards were getting a little scraggly. A bee flew in by as they walked up the porch. Clarence still kept them, despite complaints from the neighbors over the years. Grandma Lucinda opened the door to greet them, holding a newspaper. She put down the paper on the stand next to the Morris chair. "Clarence, get in here," Lucinda stated, but she wasn't heard. She disappeared into the back, looking for him, and found him working on a boat out in the yard. "You come in here, Clarence. Estelle and the children are here, and I'm just finishing my supper." "Let me know when it's ready," Clarence grumbled. "No, please come inside. It's late." It was no use. Clarence was going to stay put, working on that flat-bottom boat, until it was good and dark. It had at least an hour. Bobby put his nose into a book and flopped down on a chair in the back sitting room, whilst Martha looked at the newspaper that had been discarded on the table. They sometimes argued, but got along then on vacations. Estelle offered to help with the food preparation, but Grandma Lucinda didn't want it. Most of the cooking was done except for the pies. Estelle said, "The only way you're going to get Father in here is to offer him some pie." Lucinda chuckled, which was rare. "I suspect you're right about that. Here you go, make the crust." Later on, when supper was ready and the pies were baked, Lucinda called again for Clarence. This time the grandchildren had deliberately opened the window so that the pie smell would get to him. He sniffed around for a moment and then pulled from his work. "Supper's on, come and get it." Clarence got up grudgingly and walked into the room. As the Frees sat down for supper, Martha said grace and thanked God for the plentiful meal that had spread out, and for health. Estelle was reminded of her medical condition. The Frees family and their descendants were willing to give the hungry leftover food that they had if they needed it, but that night they were famished, so there was nothing left over. 3 generations sat at the table that evening. The next day, bright and early, Bobby got up at the sound of Grandpa working again on his boat. Grandpa made boats sometimes. Grandpa made boats sometimes and rowed them on the lake. He liked to make boats, and now that he didn't do carpentry for a living. One time he told Bobby that the key to sawing wood was soaping up that saw and then cutting it. "Fresh wood tends to stick," he said. That morning, Grandpa handed him a can of bent nails, knowing he knew what to do with them. Bobby took a wood block from the ground and used a hammer to straighten out those nails. "Never use a brick," he advised, "as it will not work so well and might ruin the nail." 2 years ago, Bobby watched his grandpa put tar on the bottom of a boat to seal it. The new boat wasn't ready for that yet. "Are we going to go fishing, Grandpa?" Bobby asked. "We always go fishing, Bobby," he smiled. The boys set out on a fishing excursion using one of the boats that was already finished. They went down to the lake where the boat was moored at the dock and untied it. Bobby put the oars in inside and climbed in. It wasn't long before they rowed out into the quiet lake, and all they could do there was the sounds of nature. Birds were singing, which was nice, but also mosquitoes were buzzing, and they didn't like that. Grandpa caught a bullhead, which was a lake fish with stinger-like horns. He said not to touch the horns, but it stung him. Since he wasn't one to swear, he just grumbled as a red mark appeared on his hand. Then he put the fish in the pail for cleaning later. Bobby knew about the lake bottom fish, including the bullheads, which had skin and scales, the pike and pickerel. Even so, Grandpa thought to mention the kind of fish as he cast out the lures to catch them. Fishing lures were usually worms or something pretty or shiny to attract the fish, but Clarence added flair to his. The lures he made were brightly colored. He had metal lures and wood ones, even feather-colored ones, to look enticing to fish. As the fish tripped, they caught on not only fish, but also a big surprise. On the fishing trip, they caught not only fish, but also a big snapping turtle. Bobby recalled that one summer he watched Grandpa cut off the turtle's head and poke it with a stick. The turtle's head would still bite, so he warned him not to put his finger near it. The turtle they caught that day would meet a similar end, as turtle soup was good eating. Clarence brought the fish back for cleaning and hung the turtle up on a tree. He cut off the head, placed it on a stump, and continued with the gutting process. The shell was pulled off quickly, and then he scooped out the stuff inside for making the soup. He never killed a turtle to waste it. Still, Bobby found it pretty gross. At dinner time, about 2 or so, that'd be lunch, they had turtle soup, bread and fish. Turtle soup had a strong and distinct flavor. Bobby remembered it for years to come, but didn't really eat it much after he grown up. The visit ended after a week. After a lot of good tidings, they parted ways. The Browns returned to Chicago, and once again, the elder grandparents were back to passing away the time together in an old house, with all the children grown. Some people controlled. Some people counted their blessings, especially in lean times. Greenville grew from a small village to a small city, and time marched forward in relentless abandon. The Freese family at first may have had their blessings deferred, but for the descendants of Clarence and Lucinda, spread out all over the country, they had their blessings attained. Note that this was created from events Robert Brown experienced as a child at 9 in Greenville over the summer of 1934, and was recreated by his son Adam, Grandma Estelle Knapp's grandson. And also, Dad wrote that when he was dying. He wrote that story when he was dying. They had the cancer. He was dying. And he wanted to write about the Greenville, because he heard about Grandma's book we were putting together, so he wanted to add that to it. So we got that little story and stuff in there. Okay, now we're going to cut to, because it's in the same universe here. What happens next? There's no sequel to this. Unless you want to watch Blessings Attained, which is on Brown Video Productions. That's the sequel. This is the prequel. So, yeah. Freese Memories, 1930s to 2003, when the book was written. The Freese family continued through the stories they told their children and grandchildren. Just as it is for most people, for all the innovations lived through in the past century. People remain the same. Societies change and grow and do not change. Disappear. Greenville continued to grow long after the impact of the Freese family passed into memory. In 1935, Estelle and her siblings learned that their father Clarence had a long-going medical condition hadn't mentioned, because he didn't take much to seeing a doctor. Evidently, it was some sort of malignant tumor. Clarence Freese died of cancer in 1936. He didn't believe in going to see a doctor, and he didn't believe to go see a doctor, and sat on his condition, which nowadays would have been treatable, even curable. But that might not have been. He was proud and opinionated to the end. Lucinda no longer wanted to live in such a big old house, so she lived with some of her children until they could find a place for her. It is not clear how many children boarded her, or for how long. In 1953, at Lucinda's 90th birthday celebration, the family got together for a picture. Lucinda and her children gathered round to have a photograph taken. She could barely recall her wedding picture and knew of her baby picture from when she was 3, and Estelle kept, but didn't recall being there for it. By the 1950s, pictures were done differently. You could actually smile in pictures. Lucinda passed away at the age of 96 in the year 1959 in a care facility. 96. Dang. Wow. Her granddaughter, Martha Mossberger, she got married after the war, World War II. Her granddaughter, Martha Mossberger, recounted the events of her death 68 years later in 2003. Lucy Freese died in prayer. She was living in a home that the Freese children chipped in to send her to. This lady they knew boarded 5 old folks, and she was the oldest. It was kind of a hospice, but not really a convalescent care facility. The folks were all gathered around standing at a table holding hands for prayer, and she died during it. She had a heart attack or a stroke, possibly. She died instantly. As for the story of the Freese family continued through their children, and eventually grandchildren. The Freese boys kept the name Freese. Then most of the girls married. They didn't keep the name Freese. In loving memory of Estelle Freese Brown Knapp, 1896 to 1996.
Fair roses around its sculptured form entwined, and grace and beauty seemed combined. And so I gazed upon its beauty more. I wondered why so many passed it o'er. But oh, that form so beautiful to see soon made its hidden sorrows known to me. Thorn lay beneath the flowers and colors fair. Sorrowing I said, this cross I may not bear. So it was with all these around, not one to suit my need should there be found. Weeping I laid each heavy burden down, and my guide gently said, no cross, no crown. At length to him I raised my saddened heart. He knew its sorrows, bade its doubt apart. But be not afraid, he said, but trust in me. My perfect love shall be shown to thee. And then with lighted eyes and willing feet, again I turned my earthly cross to meet. With forward footsteps turning not aside, for fear some hidden evil might betide. There and prepared an anointed way listening to hear, ready to obey. A cross I quickly found of plainest form, with only words of love inscribed thereon. With thankfulness I raised it from the rest, and joyful acknowledged it the best, the only one of all the many there that I could feel was good for me to bear. While I trust my chosen one confessed, I saw a heavenly brightness on its rest. And as I bent my burden to sustain, I recognized my old cross again. But oh, how different did it seem to be, that I had learned the preciousness to see. So what he loves seems good of me to send. I'll trust it best, because he knows the end.